6 years ago, I suffered a very mild stroke on the Wednesday before Easter Sunday. I recovered enough to be part of the service, but I asked my good friend Robbie Walsh, the emeritus minister at First Parish Duxbury, where Jenny grew up, to give the sermon. Robbie told the story of how he'd been getting his teeth cleaned not long before that Easter Sunday. The dental hygienist had chosen a moment when his mouth was full of instruments to say, "You're a Unitarian Universalist, right? You don't believe in the resurrection, do you?" As often happens when we're confronted with an unexpected question, Robbie was left without the right words to say. Not that he would have been able to say anything while the hygienist was scraping the tartar off his teeth. It took him a few days to remind himself of the many ways that Unitarian Universalists do believe in resurrection. We see it all around us as life returns to the earth after the winter. We see it in the lives of others and in our own lives when despair is replaced by hope, when mourning gives way and we are comforted, when love overcomes hate. I could have said on that morning that I had been reminded of how fragile my own life is and how I had returned from the hospital after a brush with my own mortality. It certainly wasn't a resurrection, but it was an occasion for rejoicing. We Unitarian Universalists sometimes get nervous talking about Easter and the resurrection, and we sometimes try to change the subject. Last year at Easter, I told you the story of a worship committee at the UU congregation of Honey Springs by Meg Barnhouse. The worship committee got together to plan their Easter service. One member said we should talk about how the name Easter is derived from Ostara, the Saxon goddess of the spring. Remember the German egg trees? And how egg hunts at dawn were celebrated on the day of the spring equinox, and how rabbits were sacred to Ostara. So, egg tree, Ostara. Another objected, saying that Easter is about Jesus, and it's about time the congregation allowed his name to be used on occasions other than when the minister stubs his toe. An anthropologist in the group offered to talk about spring rituals of fertility among the Langari people whom she had studied. And finally, another one said, well, maybe we should all just bring nice flowers and not talk about it too much. Finally, the minister suggested that really the resurrection is a story about Jesus and about how love lives on after all seems lost. And he suggested they should do something about love's power to create new life. That would be wonderful, everyone agreed. Now, I think it's important to tell the story of Jesus at Easter because that's the story that's being told all around us today, including at this morning's lovely sunrise service at Hanson's Farm, where our own male bonding band provided the accompaniment to the hymns. And maybe we can learn something new from telling the story again. Our two biggest holidays of the year, Christmas and Easter, mark the beginning and the end of the life of Jesus. This all happened 2,000 years ago. It's a very long time for any stories to be remembered. Stories about Jesus are remembered this long partly because of how he died, but somehow lived on. This past week has been known as Holy Week because the last week of Jesus' life was full of excitement and then ended in despair. Last Sunday was Palm Sunday, when many churches celebrate the story of how Jesus came into Jerusalem riding on a mule. That was a symbol of kingship because that's how King David came into Jerusalem. And the people greeted him as some sort of superhero who was going to defeat the Romans and end their occupation. And they waved palm branches, hence we have Palm Sunday. Passover is the holiday that celebrates the exodus from Egypt when the people of Israel were in slavery. That's 3,000 years ago. So large and enthusiastic crowds greeted Jesus and listened to what he had to say. Things went pretty well during most of the week. And then on Thursday night, Jesus gathered his disciples together for what's remembered as the Last Supper. And that night he gave them a new commandment, that they should love one another just as he had loved each of them. He wanted them to care for one another, to care about each other, to be like brothers and sisters to each other. The good kind, I mean, brothers and sisters on their best behavior, which all of you kids mostly are, right? At least today. And then Good Friday brought catastrophe. Jesus was sentenced to be crucified, the most painful and excruciating and humiliating form of execution that was possible. It was a method that the Romans used widely to suppress revolts by their subjects. His disciples were devastated. We all know how painful and difficult it is when someone near to us dies, the emptiness it leaves us, the sense of loss, the grief. So, of course, the followers of Jesus were deeply shocked when he had left them so suddenly, so completely, that he had left them so alone. So far, so good. We can identify with the people in this story, the excitement of the crowds on Palm Sunday, the sorrow of the followers on Good Friday. And then came Easter Sunday. And suddenly the stories have a different tone about them. Jesus somehow seemed not to be dead after all. He wasn't in the tomb where he'd been buried on Good Friday. Now, we can speculate about what really happened. We can have debates about what is true and what is false and what could possibly happen under the laws of nature and what could not possibly happen. But what we know for sure is that the followers of Jesus told each other remarkable stories about how Jesus was not really dead and gone forever, how he continued to touch their lives even after that horrible death, how he had renewed hope that compelled them to tell others the story of his life and death. A number of them said that they had seen him walking about, that he spoke to them. And then the followers of Jesus began teaching about the kingdom of heaven that he had taught them about. He had said it was already present among them, even in the midst of the oppression they were suffering. So it seems as though they experienced a new way of being in the world, a new way of being alive. In fact, they called themselves followers of the way. What Jesus taught them did not end at the grave. Love did live on. Love does have the power to create new life, even after the darkest despair. We'll never know what really happened on that first Easter morning and then the days that followed. The stories that we read in the Gospels aren't consistent with each other, and what is reported doesn't fit into familiar categories of how we think about life and death. What we do know is that something happened to create hope and courage and new life for those who had followed Jesus. We do know that their faith has had an enormous impact on our world. And we do know that none of this would have happened if they hadn't had some extraordinary experience that Easter Sunday, and that it gave new meaning and purpose to their lives out of the depths of their despair. So Easter is our opportunity to remember that there is resurrection all around us. We experience it as the earth awakens each spring. We see it in the faith that the most brutal of tyrants cannot prevail forever, that hope for liberation remains alive even in the midst of great oppression. We see it in our own lives when despair finally gives way to hope, when grief for the loss of a loved one begins to abate, when a brush with mortality reminds us of how precious life is and how we must use it wisely. Easter is a reminder that we too can make a difference in the world, and that we too can help to heal the world when we feed those who are hungry, visit those in prison, clothe those who don't have enough, and pass the love on to others. Sometimes, like in this story, we're surprised by something that just doesn't seem credible. And sometimes we have to trust our experience rather than our expectations and our predefined categories. And sometimes we just have to let mysteries be. As Mary Oliver puts it in her poem, mysteries, yes. Truly we live with mysteries too marvelous to be understood. How grass can be nourishing in the mouths of the lambs. How rivers and stones are forever in allegiance with gravity while we ourselves dream of rising. How two hands touch and the bonds will never be broken. How people come from the light or the scars of damage to the comfort of a poem. Let me keep my distance always from those who think they have the answers. Let me keep company always with those who say, look, and laugh in astonishment and bow their heads. May our lives be blessed as we open our own eyes to new possibilities, as we experience mysteries that confound and transcend our expectations, and as we too live in hope as we do our part to heal the world. Amen. And may it be so.